There were no gunshots, no bodies in the street, no police tape sealing off a block. And yet, overnight, Harlem changed the way it spoke. It started with one sentence said out of turn. Not a threat, not an insult shouted in anger, just a man who said the wrong thing to the wrong people about the wrong name. That name was Bumpy Johnson. What came next confused everyone. Bumpy didn't react. He didn't show up. He didn't issue a warning. He didn't send a message, but as word quietly traveled, something strange began to happen. Bars closed earlier than usual. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Men who never watched their mouths suddenly chose their words carefully. And then came the silence. Not fear, not panic, control. That night Harlem understood something it would never forget. By 1961, Bumpy Johnson didn't need to speak to enforce order. One careless sentence was enough for an entire neighborhood to correct itself. So the real question isn't who spoke out of turn. It's this: what happens when power becomes so absolute it no longer needs to make noise? It didn't happen in public, and it didn't sound dangerous at first. The sentence was spoken in a place where men believed they were safe. Somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar, where voices dropped and names were repeated without caution. It wasn't a threat or a challenge. It was a careless assumption, spoken with the confidence of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him that night. No one reacted immediately. There was no argument, no sudden tension. A few people exchanged looks, then pretended not to notice. The conversation drifted on, slightly thinner than before, because in Harlem in 1961, people didn't respond to dangerous words. They remembered them. What mattered wasn't what was said in the moment. It was who would hear it later. The sentence didn't travel fast. It didn't need to. It moved quietly, passed along without emotion, stripped of opinion, reduced to its most essential form. That was how information moved when power was already settled. There was no urgency, no fear in the telling, only precision. By the time it reached the right ears, the words no longer belonged to the man who spoke them. What made the mistake serious wasn't the content itself, it was the belief behind it. The belief that Bumpy Johnson's name could be spoken loosely, discussed without consequence, treated like just another topic. In Harlem, that belief was always wrong. Names here weren't words. They were lines you didn't step across. By the end of the night, the man who spoke out of turn felt nothing had changed. He left the room as he always had, walked streets he'd walked 100 times before, unaware that the environment around him had already shifted. No one stopped him. No one warned him. No one corrected him. And in Harlem, that kind of silence was never accidental. By the time the sentence reached Bumpy Johnson, it no longer sounded like gossip. It wasn't repeated with emotion or commentary. It was delivered cleanly, without explanation, the way information was passed when nothing needed to be debated. No one asked how serious it was. No one asked what should be done. The words were enough. Bumpy didn't react. He didn't raise his voice or ask for details. He didn't ask who had said it or where it had been spoken. He didn't even acknowledge the weight of it out loud, and that was exactly what unsettled the people around him. Because by 1961, those closest to Bumpy understood something clearly. When he spoke less, it meant more. There was no meeting called, no message sent back down the line, no visible response of any kind. But subtle adjustments began immediately. A conversation ended sooner than planned. A visit was postponed without explanation. A man who usually had access was told to wait. These weren't punishments. They were signals, and they traveled faster than any order ever could. What made the moment dangerous wasn't anger, it was certainty. Bumpy didn't need to confirm whether the words mattered. Everyone already knew they did. His power at this stage wasn't built on reaction. It was built on predictability. People knew the rules. They also knew what happened when someone acted like the rules were optional. And so nothing happened. No confrontation, no warning, no correction. But in Harlem, when nothing happened after a mistake, it meant the mistake had already been fully processed. The system had absorbed it, adjusted, and moved on, with or without the person who caused it. By the time the night settled in, the message was clear without ever being spoken. The words had reached the top, and the silence that followed was deliberate. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no single moment when people realized something was wrong. Instead, Harlem began to behave differently, the way a room changes when everyone senses the same tension but no one names it. Conversations grew shorter. Jokes didn't land the same way. Men who normally lingered chose to leave early, as if they had somewhere else to be. No one had been warned, no one had been threatened, yet doors closed sooner than usual, and certain faces stopped appearing where they were expected. Drivers took longer routes. Meetings that normally happened without planning were suddenly rescheduled or quietly canceled. Not because anyone had been told to, but because everyone understood what the silence meant. This was how power worked when it no longer needed enforcement. Harlem didn't wait to see what Bumpy Johnson would do. It adjusted in advance. People corrected themselves before they were corrected by someone else. Words were weighed, names were avoided. The city didn't freeze, it tightened. The man who had spoken out of turn noticed the change, but not in a way he could explain. Calls weren't returned as quickly. Familiar nods disappeared. Conversations ended when he walked into a room. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough distance to make him feel slightly out of place in places that had always welcomed him. And that was the point. Harlem didn't isolate people violently. It isolated them quietly. When someone crossed a line, the city didn't rush to punish them. It simply stopped including them. By the time night fell, the lesson was already complete. Harlem hadn't been ordered into silence. It had chosen it. And that choice told Bumpy Johnson everything he needed to know. By nightfall, the change was impossible to miss. Harlem wasn't afraid, but it was careful. Music played lower. Doors closed earlier. Corners that usually stayed alive well past midnight emptied without explanation. There were no patrols, no confrontations, no visible reason for restraint. And that was exactly what made the quiet so heavy. Inside back rooms and private apartments, conversations stalled. People spoke in half sentences, then stopped altogether. Names were left unfinished. Everyone understood the same thing without saying it. The matter had reached Bumpy Johnson, and that meant the situation no longer belonged to the streets. It belonged to the structure above them. Nothing happened that night, and that was the message. No one was called in. No one was dragged out. No example was made. Harlem was being allowed to observe itself, to feel the weight of its own adjustment. The city didn't need proof. It needed confirmation that the rules still held. The silence wasn't tense. It was disciplined, the kind that settles in when people know the boundaries and choose not to test them. Harlem had seen chaos before. This was different. This was order asserting itself without effort. Somewhere in that quiet, the man who spoke out of turn realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to point to, just enough to understand that he was no longer moving with the same freedom as before. The city hadn't turned against him. It had simply stopped making room. That night, Harlem didn't wait for consequences. It behaved as if they were already inevitable. What happened next was never discussed openly. There was no story passed around, no warning retold as a lesson. In Harlem, the most effective outcomes were the ones no one could fully describe. The man who spoke out of turn didn't disappear overnight. He wasn't chased, threatened, or publicly corrected. He was simply removed from relevance. Opportunities stopped presenting themselves. Doors that once opened easily now stayed closed a little longer, then stopped opening at all. Introductions were delayed. Familiar rooms felt colder. People who once relied on him adjusted their routines without explanation, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Harlem had already decided where the boundary was, and it wasn't going to test it twice. There was no visible hand guiding this shift, and that was the point. By 1961, Bumpy Johnson didn't need to correct mistakes personally. The system around him had learned to do it on its own. When someone stepped out of line, the city absorbed the error and quietly moved past them. The man eventually understood what had happened, but by then it was too late to fix. You couldn't take words back. You couldn't explain intent. In Harlem, intent didn't matter once the line was crossed. The rules weren't enforced through punishment anymore. They were enforced through absence, and that was the real lesson of that night. Power no longer announced itself. It didn't threaten. It didn't respond. It simply reshaped the environment until only those who understood it could continue to move freely. Harlem never talked about that night again, because everyone already knew what it meant. By the end of that night, nothing dramatic had happened. No violence, no public warning, no name written into the streets. And yet, everyone in Harlem understood the message clearly. A single careless sentence had been enough to trigger a correction so complete it didn't need to be explained. That was the level of power Bumpy Johnson held by 1961. He no longer needed to speak to be heard. He didn't need to punish to be respected. The city had learned the rules so well that it enforced them on itself. Order didn't come from fear anymore. It came from certainty. Harlem remembered that night not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. The absence of noise. The absence of reaction. The absence of anyone daring to ask questions. Silence became the lesson, and everyone learned it the same way. And that leaves one final question, one that still matters far beyond Harlem. What kind of power doesn't need to announce itself to control an entire city? Because once power reaches that point, it never has to raise its voice again.